Imagine yourself in a new city. You've relocated and you have to figure out how to get to your office building from your new house. Or consider a different problem. As you have unpacked and put objects away in your new kitchen, you've made a number of decisions about where your things will live. But now, facing the task of preparing a first meal, you have to remember where in the kitchen you've placed the items you now need. Last lecture, we talked about motor learning, which is important for how you will flip that omelet you're about to make in your new kitchen. This time, we're going to consider how you learn where things are in that kitchen, or how to get from that kitchen to work. These two sets of problems are problems of spatial learning. Spatial learning involves some aspects of skill, but also some aspects of knowledge, representations of how the world is organized in space. Spatial learning problems are problems we share with all mobile creatures on the planet. Most mobile creatures can be viewed as doing some type of foraging or hunting activity to get food and water, and many mobile creatures, as varied as squirrels, birds, and human beings, store and then later have to retrieve food or other necessities like a cell phone from various locations in their environment. And spatial learning allows us to accomplish several important tasks. Orienting, which involves knowing where we are and where desired objects or places are in relation to us and our current position. But we can also navigate using spatial learning by integrating sensory and perceptual feedback into our orientation knowledge on a kind of continuously updated basis. If you think about how complex these tasks are, it is rather magical, especially navigation. And many species have really impressive capabilities for using sensory and perceptual information about the position of the sun or the Earth's magnetic pole to orient in truly amazing ways during long migrations across the Earth. For example, the Arctic tern spends summers breeding in the Arctic and then goes for the winter towards the Antarctic for feeding. Homing pigeons can fly directly home after being placed several hundred kilometers away in unfamiliar territory. Experienced pigeons can do this even when they were under anesthesia during their outbound journey. Honeybees can also use magnetic fields to orient and navigate, and that makes their ability to forage and return to their natal or birth hive incredible. They have actually a lot of flexibility. Some work by Fred Dyer has shown that when a bee colony fissions, that is, it splits to form a daughter colony with a new queen, honeybees are able to very quickly learn their new hive location, even if it's close to the old hive, making that a difficult discrimination task. Now, if the new hive is removed, they go back to that original birth hive, and that tells us that they haven't forgotten their old route and location. Rather, they learned new ones in a very quick and very efficient way. There are also distinct navigational tasks that vary in their demands, and two of those that matter a lot to human beings are piloting and path integration. Piloting is finding a goal by familiar reference points. So piloting is a very typical navigational task for most animals and humans. This is the major task in getting to and from work and school and play. Now, path integration is a little bit different. In path integration, you might wander around widely. For example, you might be wandering around in the forest hunting deer, but when it's time to go back to camp, you take the straightest path home. This is also called dead reckoning. Now, path integration also happens for human beings on a daily basis when, for example, you run a bunch of errands and then you return home via the most direct path to your house. Human beings can't read magnetic fields, but our spatial abilities are not terrible. We're actually quite good. In fact, what we have in common with honeybees and other species is that we learn cognitive maps of our spaces. A cognitive map is a representation of the new space that will let you accomplish many different actions within the new location and to flexibly navigate that space. A good cognitive map shows us where we are, where important objects or landmarks are, and the possible paths that we can travel to move around from one point to another within our space. A good cognitive map is a good thing indeed, but where and how do we get one? For most humans in the modern world, there are actually a number of ways we encounter spatial information. Perhaps the most primary way is through direct perceptual experience. Now, perceptual experiences are both static, like when you stand still and look at the array of items in a space, and they're also dynamic, as when you move around and through a new environment, and you learn what routes there are and what kinds of objects are within that environment. Now, our ability to make use of static visual perception to build maps of spaces we're observing is present very early in our life. Research suggests that already, by 3 to 4 months of age, infants are distinguishing between different areas of a spatial array that they look at. Now, researcher Paul Quinn showed infants a very simple spatial array in which they looked at a screen that was divided by a horizontal or a vertical bar into 2 halves. So some infants saw an up-down half and others saw a left-right half. He then habituated the infants, got them used to and a little bit bored with a diamond shape that would be located on, for example, the left half of the display. So this means, again, he showed them the image till they're bored and they're kind of looking away. They're not very interested anymore. Then Paul Quinn shows them the diamond in a new location. And he did that in one of 2 ways. He either showed those babies who'd been looking at the diamond on the left, he either showed them a diamond on the lower left when it was in the upper left, or he showed them a diamond on the other half of the vertical bar, that is in a different part of the spatial array the babies were looking at. Now, infants showed a preference for looking at the diamond. They showed greater dishabituation when that diamond had moved to the opposite half of the space. What this means, if very little infants are able to distinguish between different halves of space, what it means is that babies are already learning where stuff is. They're already using just a static visual to build a cognitive map of the space that they're looking at. Now, that map they're building includes different halves, so a left and a right half or an up and a down half. It also includes ideas about where objects are in the space the baby has mapped. That is, where is the diamond located? And this makes sense because spatial abilities are almost certainly part of our evolutionary heritage, and as such, we'd expect to see them very early in our lives. Now, as we get older, we can experience the spatial world in more ways. By moving through the world, so we get some dynamic visual experience, and by using abstract representations like maps or verbal descriptions of a space. So we can also ask, is it better for me to devote time to driving around my new city or wandering around my new office building? Or is it better and more efficient to study a map of the city? And how well do we make use of those descriptions people give about how to get to a specific place to add and extend these kinds of cognitive maps? Now, let's first introduce a little bit of terminology to help us think about these issues. One important distinction in this research is between 2 different perspectives that you might have on space. Allocentric perspectives are perspectives that are not necessarily specific to your own position within a space. A typical way to represent an allocentric view is to think about a map or to consider a kind of mental model of a space. For example, if you're thinking about your house, you can do so in an allocentric way by imagining the floor plan. Now, if you do this, you can see that this perspective has a number of advantages. One is that you can move it around and rotate it in different ways. Another is that you can consider how spaces within the house are related to one another more easily. You can see multiple possible routes by which you could move from point A to point B within your house. And you can also make judgments more easily about how far apart 2 areas of the house are, or where one object is in relation to another object in the house. Now, an allocentric representation of a space does not change when you move to a different vantage point, and it is an allocentric view that's helpful for path integration. Egocentric perspectives are a different way of thinking about space, and these are perspectives that have to do with where we are standing and how we are moving. These are sometimes called route perspectives. In an egocentric perspective, what you represent of your house is the experience you have of walking or moving through the house. Egocentric perspectives are less flexible than allocentric ones, but importantly, egocentric perspectives are one of the central ways that we actually experience spaces that we're in and arrays of objects that we move through. So one of the important issues in spatial learning is how we move from what is an egocentric perspective in our everyday experience to an allocentric one over time and with increased experience. And there are some specific cases where egocentric perspectives are actually better. One of them is route knowledge. Egocentric perspectives can be very useful and maybe even maximally useful for piloting. Now, early work by Barbara Tversky and her colleagues, including Holly Taylor, suggested that people attempt to build an allocentric representation from their experiences, regardless of how those experiences unfold. So, for example, in one study, they gave people either a route-based description or a survey-like description. Now, the route-based description might sound something like this. To find the laboratory, as you enter the building, turn left. You will pass the main departmental office, the office of the chair, the office of the associate chair, and 2 additional faculty offices. At the end of the hallway, turn right. You will see 2 classroom doors on the left, and then a large wooden door on your right. That door leads to the reception area of our laboratory. In contrast, a survey-like description would sound like this. The building is rectangular with rectangular hallways that are situated between a central core of rooms and an additional rectangular layout of rooms around the outer walls of the building. Faculty offices and the main office are situated on the southern hallway along both sides of the hall. Classrooms and laboratory rooms are situated on the western hallway, with classrooms along the outer walls and laboratories on the inner walls. Our laboratory is the first laboratory door on the west hallway. Afterwards, participants were queried about various aspects of the spatial layout that they had learned to assess what kind of cognitive map they had created. Participants were equally quick and accurate in responding to questions, regardless of whether they received a route-based description or a more survey-like allocentric description. What Tversky and Taylor concluded is that people actually attempt to build a survey-like allocentric representation immediately, even when they're getting information from a more egocentric perspective. Other work suggests that as people experience an environment through navigation, they increasingly build a more allocentric representation, beginning with landmarks that help them to orient, then connecting landmarks with routes, and finally integrating various routes to arrive at something more map-like. Now, it is interesting and also important to note that our cognitive maps are not veridical. That is, they're not precisely accurate in representing the world that we live in. Instead, they're cognitive approximations. They're representations that work well enough. Here's an exercise in using one of your cognitive maps. Without consulting a real map, which city lies farther east, New York City or Chicago? How about Reno, Nevada and San Diego, California? Many people incorrectly respond that Reno is east of San Diego, and this happens actually to not be the case. We make this error because our cognitive maps of the United States are not veridical representations of maps we've seen. Rather, they're organized along various geographic boundaries, like state boundaries and country boundaries, and the Pacific Ocean. When we're asked to answer questions based on our map, that organization leads us astray. The states of California and Nevada and the inland versus coastal location of these 2 cities leads us to make an incorrect prediction. That prediction actually shows us that our maps are often more regular and more squared off than real spaces. Now, as implied by early behaviorist work that shows tacit learning of mazes by rats, we do a lot of our spatial learning without devoting explicit attention to that process. That is, what we pay attention to is the immediate problem we have of getting from point A to point B. Over time, we make use of the experiences of getting from point A to point B and also points C, D, E, and F. We make use of these experiences of getting around to build a more allocentric cognitive map. Now, in some more recent work, Taylor and colleagues got interested in the issue of whether our goals for learning a spatial environment were relevant to how we represent the environment in cognitive maps. So it is the case that we often vary in our spatial learning goals. Sometimes we actually just want to learn the best route from point A to point B. Other times we actually really want to understand where we are and how different areas are located with respect to one another. Other times we really do want to have a map. And might these different goals actually affect the strategies we use in spatial learning and our spatial learning outcomes? Well, consider the following example study. In this study, children were actually asked to learn the layout of a funhouse, or they were asked to learn the best route through the funhouse. And kids did very different things to learn about the environment depending on which goals they were asked to pursue. So kids who were asked to learn the layout of the funhouse spent more time in more rooms, and they also used a slide in the funhouse to help them get a bird's eye perspective. And those kids actually then had better knowledge about how rooms were related to one another within the funhouse. But adults often use maps to learn more information about areas in addition to navigation. So to learn about these issues with adults requires us to look at how adults use map-related information in learning, in addition to using maps for navigation. To do this, Taylor and colleagues asked people to do one of two learning tasks. They were either asked to learn the layout of the psychology department at Tufts University, that is, form an allocentric map of the psych department, or they were asked to learn the fastest routes between rooms and complexes, and this would make use of a more egocentric cognitive map of that same area. Now, participants were then assigned to either learn by wandering around the department, by actually engaging in navigation, or by studying a map. So you have two goals, a layout versus a route goal, and you have two types of information, a route-based navigation experience or an actual map. After the learning phase, participants were tested in a variety of ways to see what they had learned about the spatial layout. They were asked to estimate the distances between two locations. They were asked to describe how different rooms were related to other rooms, and they were challenged to figure out the fastest route between rooms. For tasks that required route-based knowledge, participants with a route goal were more accurate, and in some cases, learning through navigation was superior. So remember the idea of transfer-appropriate encoding, where how well you learn is affected by how similar your encoding is to the way in which you're going to need to use the knowledge you've acquired? This is a prime example. People who had had a route goal assigned, learned through navigation, ended up being better at the route-based knowledge task. Now, for tasks that assessed survey or allocentric perspective knowledge, like describing how different rooms in the building were related to one another in space, goals didn't really turn out to matter, but the learning method mattered a lot, and in this case, maps were superior at helping people learn that allocentric map. So the take-home message here is that if you're engaged in learning a new area, maps serve one set of needs. For example, if you want to get a sense of the layout of the entire space and how places in that space are related to each other, navigation serves a different set of needs best. That is, of course, navigation needs, getting from one point to another. But over time, navigation is going to contribute to the building of an allocentric model, a more map-like model. And this is probably because those allocentric models are more effective for being able to navigate flexibly from any point to any other point. That is, for a specific navigation task, you may not need the layout of the entire space, but when you want to have options, the layout, that allocentric model, is a critical thing to have. Now, it is hard to address spatial learning without considering gender. Stereotypes about gender, wayfinding, willingness to ask for directions, and spatial functioning abound. And there are a fair number of studies that show sex differences in spatial learning, and these studies usually show that men outperform women at spatial learning. Moreover, those differences are actually evident across multiple studies and even across multiple species. Now, having said that, it may depend upon what the task is. Not all research supports the existence of a general male spatial advantage. Looking only at human studies, like the study described above, in which people were given spatial information in different ways and were asked to achieve different goals while learning a space, in those studies, no gender differences in performance were observed. Another study by Lavenex and Lavenex asked men and women to learn a real environment, one that included various landmarks and had rewards positioned around the space. They also found no gender differences. Now, it's instructive to look at how they make sense of their findings versus previous work on navigating spaces for rewards. They suggest that we need to think about several things before we conclude that women are poorer at navigation and spatial learning. First, we need to make sure we don't confuse spatial learning, what we've been talking about in this lecture, with other tasks that involve spatial abilities but aren't necessarily critical for developing a cognitive map. For example, rotating objects mentally is a common spatial ability task. It's one in which men show a very strong advantage, but it's not critical for spatial navigation and wayfinding of the type we've been emphasizing here. Second, they suggest that women in their studies show some distinctive strategies for exploring the environment, even when they did similarly well. So most importantly, women were more likely to explore the environment extensively, and Lavenex suggest this may result in poorer performance depending on what you count as good performance. If you're going for efficiency, women will be viewed as doing badly if they engage in excess exploration. That's not critical for solving the task. If, on the other hand, you take a longer-term perspective, then, as I say when I've recently moved, getting lost has some longer-term value in terms of building a more complex and thorough map. And that's true for both genders, even if one gender gets lost a bit more than the other. Finally, I want to consider some issues about designing spaces in relation to our spatial learning. When I finished my PhD, I did postdoctoral research at the Max Planck Institute for Human Development, which is located in Berlin, Germany. It's a beautiful building to look at. When you enter the building, you're in a large, spacious lobby area, and you have diagonally oriented staircases that go up to various hallways. And the hallways are also diagonally oriented and have offices to one side with central gathering areas placed periodically around the hallways. The building itself has this odd and irregular shape that surrounds an internal garden area, and you can enter that garden area from the ground floor cafeteria. Here's the catch. The three staircases appear to all take you to one location and one level, but that turns out not to be true. And the hallways all look exactly the same. And this means that when you begin to work in this building, it's very easy to get lost. And actually, it happens to virtually every new employee for at least 1 or 2 months. Most of us have encountered at least one such building in our lifetimes. There's another building of this sort on my current campus, and I haven't had to learn that building, so whenever I have to go to a meeting there, my strategy is to wander around looking disoriented until a staff person from the building takes me and walks me directly to my destination. And there are buildings that may be deliberately designed to keep us wandering around merchandise shelves because more time in the store means more dollars at the register. So you can ask, is it me and my lack of spatial learning ability? What makes buildings like this? We could say they're just complicated, but that seems a little bit like sidestepping the issue, because what does it really mean when we say a building is complicated? So it turns out researchers have actually tried to address this. And plan complexity, as they call it, for a building has several features. So one feature that makes buildings more or less complicated is the number of choice points or hallway intersections. The more choice points you have, the more complicated the building is to learn. Another feature related to plan complexity is how many signs there are and how visible they are. So both of the buildings I have mentioned lack any signs that can help people figure out where they are in the building and where they might need to go. Now, a broader array of issues affect learning to navigate a building, and these include visual access, how well can you see one part of the building from another, and architectural differentiation, which is a fancy way of saying how distinctive are different areas of the building from one another. Thinking about these three features suggests that my most difficult building is indeed a very difficult building. Visual access to the hallways from the main entrance area is poor. The hallways have corners that impede visibility of the more distinctive commons areas. The hallways all look exactly the same. And the complexity of the plan is generally large. There are a lot of nonlinear hallways, and in many offices, the floors also slant into one another, so it's difficult to keep track of what floor you're on. Now, research on the complexity of different buildings using this way of counting up plan complexity shows that buildings higher in complexity cause problems for people in wayfinding and make it longer for people who work in those buildings to acquire a good allocentric map of the building. Now, for buildings that are designed primarily for use by insiders, like the building where I did my postdoctoral work, this is fine. There's no need for a stranger to walk in and be able to navigate the building immediately with speed or accuracy. But in other buildings, like libraries, hospitals, and hotels, you need lower plan complexity because you need strangers to be able to quickly come in and navigate the building and acquire a sense of the plan. So what should these buildings have in terms of design with this idea in mind? Well, one idea is that these buildings need to be organized along one central axis. That makes them simpler to understand and it reduces the number of choice points. A second idea here is that those buildings need to maintain visual access. You need to be able to see different parts of the building from other parts of the building. And finally, one idea is that these buildings need to keep different areas distinct in color and form and other properties that help people figure out quickly where they are. Now, in addition to properties of buildings, of course, some of the problem really is in us, and some of it is in human beings in general. But other aspects of the problem are specific to individuals. So a general human problem is that people bring assumptions to bear on constructing a cognitive map. And so, for example, people tend to assume that every floor in a building is similarly structured, whether or not that is the case. People also tend to simplify and therefore distort their cognitive maps. And in some more complicated buildings, this distortion will actually be a problem in ways that our Reno and San Diego confusion generally isn't such a big deal. And finally, some of us really are not so good at navigation, while others are. And researchers are only beginning to understand why that might be and what it means. To summarize, we come into the world equipped for learning about space and objects within it from very early infancy. And as we get older, learning our way around happens first through navigation and eventually through the use of maps and other representations. And these distinct ways of representing a space have implications for what we learn. But it looks like in general over time, what we're always trying to build is a cognitive map that lets us represent space flexibly and with enough, though not necessarily precise, accuracy. Although wayfinding often involves a lot of attention and conscious work, the spatial learning that arises from it is often relatively tacit, meaning we don't know we have that knowledge until we have to call on it. This is somewhat distinct from some of the types of learning we have talked about so far. And we'll turn next to another type of learning that is often also relatively tacit, and that's learning to tell stories. Even though that kind of learning, too, is often acquired without conscious attention, it's very distinct in other ways from spatial and motor learning.